Well, the Genocide Convention requires the punishment and prevention of the crime of genocide, and states that are dealing, well, states within the international community actually have to, punishment can involve military action, and military action would be literally death to the IDF. So even within a liberal institution established largely by Western powers, death to the IDF, which again is just speech, it's not material killing, of course, it is legitimate.
The ones who found that it was okay to colonize anywhere from Hong Kong to North America and pretty much all of Africa and Asia are now telling us that these simple words of death to the IDF are intolerable and worthy of heavy condemnation.
Bob Dylan is that he epitomizes that new generation who is not molded, not pressured into accepting that narrative anymore. You had an older generation with good people such as Jeremy Corbyn, who still went into the mea culpa route. I'm sorry, mea culpa. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I don't mean it. Oh, I'm going to do a research against anti-Semitism in my party. I don't accept anti-Semitism. No. This stuff is what they want. You lose at that moment. You accept the narrative. They have you in the corner.
When the press, by the way, was representing Trump as anti-NATO, I think he's the great rejuvenator of NATO, in fact, then you're not going to be able to change hearts and minds. It's kind of pitiful. How much does the Iranian message get out to Western audiences? How much of an effort do they make? And the same thing for China. It's almost like everything about China is just the knowledge about China is constructed by, well, journalists and Western elites and those who write books and yellow peril types and so on and so forth. And I think, I remember reading China just took out 35,000 workers out of Libya before the bombing, and I understand, but they're totally pacifistic. Now, how are you going to build? The thing is this, that like, if you're going to have economic investment in foreign countries, sadly, you're going to have to bring some military might to protect that economic investment.
When the United States intentionally, purposefully bombed China's embassy in Yugoslavia and in Belgrade, China never responded.
I would say Russia seems opportunistic. I would agree exactly with everything you've said, Kareem. Even on their conduct with Israel. In December of 2023, Sergei Lavrov said that the connection between Israel and Russia is forever lasting due to the opposition to the Nazis. Russia is largely dominated by Western Slavs, largely, historically. Maybe the Soviet Union was an attempt to kind of change that or propagandize in favor of that, if you will. Like, we have Asians, we have women, and so on. But it's largely dominated by Western Europeans. Its civilization looks towards the West.
Good evening or good day, everyone. We are here with another show and with a good friend of Reason to Resist, Rami, and also his cousin Zaid, or Zed, or Zaid, or Zaid. You can say it in many ways. So I hope there's one of those was correct. I saw you actually last time at Dimitri's show talking about what happened with Iran and other aspects of global geopolitics, and I was impressed, and I was like, okay, I'd love to have a conversation with you as well, Rami. Of course, we know you already. We also met in Hong Kong here, or I should say here in China. That sounds more impressive, and that was a very good experience, good click. And I thought, okay, let's have a roundtable and talk about the things that are going on right now. And the first thing I actually wanted to start with, relatively lighthearted, is what we just saw happening in Britain. I think it happened in Britain, right, with the iris band kneecap. And where you're not, so you are allowed to say death to Nazis. You're also allowed to say, here it comes. Even in the Netherlands, you're allowed to say death to Arabs. Okay, and the whole ethnic group. That's all fine. But the guy of kneecap, Bob Dylan, said death to the IDF. talks
No,
about.
he's a separate artist. He's not in Kneecap.
He's a separate artist, right?
Yeah.
And he said, "Death to the IDF." He talks about a military institute, and of course, the whole Western world goes, "How dare you say that about a military institution that has been committing genocide for 2 years and killing babies and raping women and children and men?" And that's not allowed in the West. So, what your thoughts about this? I see Rami wanted to say something, so please go ahead.
I mean, the first statement that I read was from the festival themselves, and they said that Bob Dylan crossed the line. And I'm just very curious, where's that line? How is it crossed? And then I think you had Keir Starmer say that this was definitely, definitely went over what's allowed in terms of freedom of speech. What's ironic here is that the more you try to repress people's concerns or grievances towards a genocide happening, people take the necessary measures to be heard. Kneecap, this famous Irish band from Belfast, unapologetically pro-Ireland, pro-Irish identity, especially with all the oppression that they're experiencing in Belfast. They started off by they were the first ones that really, in that whole UK scene of showing great support for Palestine during their concerts. I even think there's a footage of them waving the flag of Hezbollah. And then the BBC decided not to stream their concert during the on television, and instead decided to show Bob Dylan. And I feel like that would kind of be a move of like a scab move to just take this platform and not honor Kneecap. And by doing so, BBC shot themselves in the foot by pretty much airing a support for Palestine that we've never seen before. I mean, I've never heard this chant, death to the IDF, and I've been to more protests than I can count on a hand. So, so to see this kind, I mean, I think this is a natural reaction. You're trying to censor this movement, and people will want to be heard, and the only way they'll be heard is if they cross that line that was predetermined and set by these people that have endorsed this genocide for more than 7 years. So, and I mean, you could hear the people in the crowd. No one's angry at it. Everyone's probably joining in the chants. I mean, the singer himself, you could barely hear him in the sea of chants of people singing "Death to the IDF." And this one will probably stick. I'm seeing it in popular culture on Instagram. People are posting tweets, memes with the slogan "Death to the IDF." So it's a bit like this Barbra Streisand effect, where the more you try to crack down, the more you're actually doing a disservice to the people they're trying to protect, in this case, a genocide. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit like free Palestine, or from the river to the sea. They try to, or of course the flag itself. So you have a melon instead of that. So they try everything to criminalize being against the genocide, and for us to force us to pamper and protect those demons who are committing a genocide. I find it baffling the way the West is currently. Yeah, it's losing narrative control, and you see that in these insane crackdowns on speech, which is really, it's really, we live in a reverse reality. It's really 1984. You're being against genocide is bad, being in favor of genocide is good, war is peace, all that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? But yeah, maybe you have some thoughts, Zaid.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. I think we should remember that Mo Chara, so one of the members of Kneecap, is under terrorism charges. An absolute incredible usage of the state in order to criminalize any form of dissent, as well as crushing civil liberties for people. And I agree, of course, like, we consider coercion, consent, and so on. You push too hard on the coercion side, like Rami's describing, as it relates to controlling public opinion, narrative, well, you're going to get a dialectic effect on the other side, where people are going to start revolting more and more. The air that they breathe is being suffocated. And I think free speech in any form of democratic society is crucial. So that's the first thing. The second thing is also to just look at the tremendous amount of support by young people. So I know the conservatives in the U.S. often like to use the word silent majority, but the silent majority really is starting to speak up, and that's a more radical, or let's say a leftist, working class, young people, majority and just marginalized people that are willing to speak up on behalf of Palestine. Of course, good people of good conscience as well. And so I would say as well, we can just evaluate this from a perspective of, is it okay to, well, one aspect, of course, is it okay to say death to the IDF? If one considers the Genocide Convention, what the ICC is kind of considering prosecuting Israel over and looking into it. Well, the Genocide Convention requires the punishment and prevention of the crime of genocide. And states that are, states within the international community actually have to, punishment can involve military action, and military action would be literally death to the IDF. So even within a liberal institution established largely by Western powers, death to the IDF, which again is just speech, it's not material killing, of course, it is legitimate. So it's really interesting. When you read articles, there's never a moral foundation or evidence or a norm that's placed on the ground. And it's very helpful to look at, law, and law largely formed on some form of morality, of course, detached from it after the Enlightenment period, if we will. But it is a very useful tool. And so I look at it in that way. So I would also say now we might be at a tipping point or a turning point. And that turning point might be pronouncing oneself in support of Palestine now creates a form of prestige. How popular is kneecap now? Would they have been this popular? And what about the other gentleman, Bob Villain? I mean, that's a really cool name as well, too. And he's got a certain style on stage, and Death the IDF is pretty catchy. I mean, how come I didn't think of that before? And so prestige internationally is being attributed to people in good conscience that are resisting this. And actually, it's their moral, like in the case of kneecap, it's their moral fortitude that they're just not standing down. And I think that's tremendously inspiring. And let's not forget, you mentioned, Rami, that they are from Belfast. These are British citizens. You have Keir Starmer speaking out against them. The whole state feels, or is forced, compelled from forces within themselves or forces outside of themselves to condemn kneecap and to try to, it doesn't seem like they can actually stop this ascent though.
Zaid, can I just add something, right? You've mentioned this social clout, right, of now standing with Palestine is in some way beneficial for one's career. I didn't know Bob Dylan before. I maybe a few hours after I saw this video of him chanting "Death to the IDF," I went on Instagram. They were at 80,000 followers. I refreshed the page a few days later, and they're now at like 200,000. So clearly, there's something interesting going on there. But Zaid, I think we should also tackle this from like an anti-colonial standpoint without going too deep into identity politics. Bob Villain, again, I don't know much about them. I heard one of their songs called "You Want Your Country Back." They're performing under a stage name. No one knows their real names, but we could clearly assume that they are either immigrants or children of immigrants. And then there's Kneecap from West Belfast. And when you look at the contrast here, right, it's like these are descendants of immigrants. These are people living under unrecognized rule in Belfast under the British rule. And having, as you mentioned, Zaid, Keir Starmer, right, the head of state, I definitely see kind of these recurring patterns of like a colonial framework being imposed and regulating speech. And it's that same empire that committed probably the worst atrocities in history of humanity, and the ones who found that it was okay to colonize anywhere from Hong Kong to North America and pretty much all of Africa and Asia are now telling us that these simple words of death to the IDF are intolerable and worthy of heavy condemnation. While under just right now in Belfast, there's a festival every year around this time of the year. It's called Orange Day, where they set up huge bonfires and they burn the flag of Ireland. And we see kind of petty attacks against Catholics and Irish folks in so-called Northern Ireland. So it's just a selective outrage. There's way more worse things happening in the UK than a single chant of death to the IDF. Yet this is basically state-sponsored oppression of Irish people and immigrants. I think there was also last year or 2 years ago, there was like these huge riots of like these white supremacists in the UK storming against these immigrant communities. And this was not death to the IDF in simple words. This was basically death to immigrants in practice. And we didn't see that same united reaction so quickly against these pogroms, basically.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on a point both of you made, which I think is really surprising for in my lifetime. I haven't seen it, but public opinion polls clearly show the kind of age divide that you guys were talking about. It's really massive. But even beyond the gap between like millennials and Zoomers and Z and Boomers, you also have a really surprising, I mean, really unprecedented in anyone's lifetime. The latest opinion poll I saw was support for Israel. Like they asked, do you sympathize more with the Israelis or Palestinians? Among Democrats in the U.S., support for Israel is down to like 20%, which is just mind blowing. Because if you look up that same poll, that same question just 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it's the exact opposite. So there's, on the one hand, like you guys were saying, it's now cool to be pro-Palestinian in the broader kind of youth popular culture, and we've got these public opinion polls showing that majorities of people in all sorts of Western countries, although I focus mostly on the U.S. polls, are leaning towards the Palestinian side. But you guys are in North America. What's the what impact are you starting to see, if any, of that really historic shift in public opinion? Do you see any signs of that being reflected in the political system yet, or do you think this is a kind of wave that's building up and it hasn't made impact yet?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of public opinion, in certain urban areas, you see a lot of expressions of support for Palestine. Sometimes it's even juxtaposed with the Ukrainian flag. So whatever one might think about Ukraine or Palestine, the person's heart is clearly in the right place. So I would argue it's not good to have Ukrainian civilians fleeing and dying, and whatever the cause may be. So you see those expressions. You see mass protests as well, people in the rain and so on and so forth. I think there's a huge difference, and not just as it relates to Palestine. It could be on labor rights or women's issues even. There's a huge divide between public opinion as well as with regards to what the state does. I mean, here in Canada, the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has said some things almost sounding like a fig leaf towards Palestine. And then on the other hand, talking about, and this is a contradiction of contradictions, but it shows the totalitarian form of the way he thinks, is that we should have a Zionist Palestinian state. Palestinians should endorse a system that creates their own genocide, apartheid, demographic control, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a huge disconnect. But just at a certain point, the groundswell of public opinion and actions is hopefully going to take effect. But I'm not a real believer in bourgeois democracy really representing the interests of the people. I mean, I think that's clear as day. You know, when in the United States, people want, public health care, if you will. And, there's never even a debate or a discussion about it. And so, and that's just one example. There have been studies about this. Public opinion by the masses does not, in the United States, I would argue it's very similar in Canada, maybe a little bit better, but it does not influence public policy whatsoever. What influences public policy is the wealthy elite. And the wealthy elite and business interests, essentially. And of course, there are key business interests, whether it's technology or the military industrial complex and so on. And so right now, I think I'm a bit of a pessimist. I just find in a liberal order, there is so much smoke and mirrors. And of course, Trump is changing that because he's moving the Overton window to the right, if you will, what's acceptable. And so now we're seeing institutions internationally established by the liberal order becoming radical. And so not even negotiating with Iran or bombing them while they're discussing with Iran, forcing European countries to invest 5% of military spending into NATO. When the press, by the way, was representing Trump as anti-NATO, I think he's the great rejuvenator of NATO, in fact, okay, with his approach. And so I don't think it's gotten to the political class just yet. And it's got to be clear here. We have Mossad or Zionist organs that are very powerful in Canada that have direct connections to the government. I'll give one example that seems apparent to me. It's that anytime something happened of significance in Gaza, or what the Western press considered significant, or the state, the government decided had to respond to, it would take them, a day or a day and a half to issue a statement about some hospital being bombed. And when you looked across the spectrum, the words being used by the Canadian diplomats were so uniform, and they sounded exactly like in the UK or Australia. And so they're really waiting, and like a corporate meeting to say, how do we address this crisis? They're waiting for their orders, and then they're distributing them. And you can go even further to the state broadcaster here in Canada, CBC, but also the private entities. They're really the same in that respect, the private media corporation. So there's a lot of pressure on them. There's a lot of utilizing the lawfare, to tie people up from speaking out against against Israel, or allowing student unions to vote for a boycott of Israel. So then tying up the university in that. And so I think it's going to take some time still, but we really need people power. And I think, seeing, like, I'm a bit encouraged that there's like some labor strifes, not related to Palestine, of course, labor strife for the subsistence and better wages and better benefits for postal workers and others. I'm a bit encouraged by that, because labor needs to detach itself from capital, and the nation state is the political superstructure of capital. When there's a natural contradiction or antagonism of forces between labor and capital, and when they're rowing in the same direction, we've seen the Canadian Auto Workers Union and some of these types endorse Trump, okay, or the I'm sorry, I meant the U.S. auto workers, and so when they're rowing in the same direction, well, labor is not independent, and that means that the movement has been decapitated. Labor is really what can actually cause, in the words of Georges Sorel, the French anarcho-syndicalist, a general strike, the mythology of the general strike. And of course, we've seen the Palestinians and colonized people do such actions as well, but we need it here as well in the West. So until there's going to be some real groundswell of not just protest, but that we can actually do activities that impact the economic framework or system, then it's not going to change that much, is my opinion.
And Peter, I think my biggest concern is that, if we base ourselves on the struggle of the indigenous folks here in North America, and as well as the of South Africa, there's always this fear of the Palestinian cause, despite having more and more public and popular support. It could oftentimes fall in line with this liberal view of what Palestinian liberation looks like. And it then brings up this whole dynamic between like the good Palestinians and the bad Palestinians. So first of all, I've discussed Palestine with a lot of people during my time at the student union. I was seen as a radical for advocating for the BDS movement, and I'm not even in support of the BDS movement at this time, because I find it a bit more reformist and counterproductive in certain internal dealings of how it's dealt with groups that were in support of Sami Doon and so on. But then again, right, so there's this whole shift between who are the good Palestinians and who are the bad Palestinians, right? Who should the liberals in the West start supporting, and who should we start condemning? And this is why I'm bringing this back to this whole thing about Bob Dylan here, is because when he's chanting death to the IDF, he's pushing away this whole like liberal narrative, right? It's basically coming in support for armed resistance, which is the most, what contributed the most to the liberation of Palestine has been the armed resistance and so on. So I do see more support, but that for Palestine here in the West, but I'm very wary of how that support is being translated. We're seeing a victory of Zoran Mandani in the New York, what's it called again? Primaries, right, for the Democratic nomination for the mayor elections. But I do not see that materially translate into anything productive for Palestine. And at the same time, we're shifting the focus and the narrative. It was seen to be a bit more hardline to come in support of Iran in their defense campaign, right? They got attacked unilaterally, unprovoked by Israel. It was seen a bit divisive to come in support for Iran, yet Zoran Mandani was able to get much more support and was seen as a victory for Palestine. But I'm really curious to see how that would physically translate into anything productive for the cause. So just to summarize, we're still in this whole this whole framework where there are good ways to resist for Palestine and bad ways, and the bad ways are dictated by this whole liberal order, right? This the status quo.
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
think
you also see that, of course.
it was just a quick follow up. The point about translation, like you can have a majority of people in a country have more sympathy for the Palestinians and the Israelis, but if they don't have much information, much knowledge, they'll hear some politician say, oh yeah, we need to care for the Palestinians and human rights for them too, and blah blah blah, whatever. That's just window dressing, and they'll say, oh great, somebody's doing something excellent. I support them. Okay, going back to sleep. So it's that issue of translating the broad public support into concrete action that works.
Yeah, the power of the West has always been, besides, of course, its military and economic power. I said one of the biggest powers of the West, of course, has always been the power of narrative. The West has always been really good at, I call it a colonial mentality, really good at mentally colonizing people around the world, including ourselves within the West. We grew up literally believing that we live in a very free, liberal world and that the rest of the world is backwards, that the history also is mainly enlightened European Western history and all that kind of stuff. And with that narrative control, the West was really good at controlling the world, including here in Asia. Okay, I've lived in Malaysia, here in Hong Kong. I know what colonial mentality is. I know what internalized Western superiority is around the world. It's deep and it has been super successful. What you see now with Palestine and the resistance against Palestine and against what's happening in Palestine and the newer generation is actually that this narrative control is completely collapsing. And the persistent support for genocidal colonialism of the West contributes to that. That speeds it up tremendously. The West is unable. It's unable to disconnect itself from genocidal colonialism. It can't do it. It's so interwoven with this kind of system. And what you see with somebody like Bob Dylan is that he epitomizes that new generation who is not molded, not pressured into accepting that narrative anymore. You had an older generation with good people such as Jeremy Corbyn, who still went into the mea culpa route. I'm sorry, mea culpa, mea culpa. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I don't mean it. Oh, I'm going to do a research against anti-Semitism in my party. I don't accept anti-Semitism. No. This stuff is what they want. You lose at that moment. You accept the narrative. They have you in the corner. People like Bob Dylan don't, and Kneecap don't. So they try everything to criminalize you. It's so frustrating to them. Like, you guys need to accept this is anti-Semitism. Bow to us. And they don't. And once you break that, once you don't let them control the narrative anymore, their whole system of power collapses. It completely collapses. And I love seeing this. I think this is so necessary. You need also politicians who are unapologetic. Somebody like, for example, in the United States, Kshama Sawant. Kshama Sawant is unapologetic. And sometimes people say, oh, you should laugh more. You should have a kinder expression. A bit like, for example, and then they say Zoran, what's his name? Zoran Mamdani? Yeah, Zoran Mamdani. But he already tends into that kind of liberal mold, because I've seen an interview where he said, like, I will do anything to protect my Jewish citizens because they feel so threatened right now in these terrible times. And like, it gives me a bit Corbyn vibes, you know what I mean? But this is more of a comment. Maybe you guys have some thoughts.
I have a question, right? Because you're mentioning this big support for Palestine and being unapologetic might push politicians to be less on the defensive. But this was way before my times. But I feel like we've seen something similar during the whole Vietnam War, where people were all rallied against the Vietnam War. You guys might be much more aware than me. But I mean, that generation ended up being that same
I
generation.
was not born yet, Rami. How old do you
No.
think we are, man? I'm from the
I mean,
80s, dude.
I just assume people would, who in academia are, they've lived it all.
Good.
But
You
the
softened the
generation
blow. Good.
that opposed the war in Vietnam, I believe there were statistics that shown that they were also overwhelmingly in support of the war in Iraq. So I'm just always very wary about how, we keep saying that the 20 to 4, the generation of 16 to 39 all supports Palestine. But does that will that necessarily mean that when that generation grows older, they will be fully rehabilitated, right? Or they'll stick to their morals.
That's
I
such
tend
a
not
that,
to worry
that,
about.
just quick comment, Peter, and then I'll give it to you. That's such a good point, because that's what my dad always said. My dad always said, when you're young and you don't have anything to lose, you're a radical and you have ideals, but the moment you got stuff to lose, you become right wing. You know what I mean? You become conservative. You will want to keep the stuff that you have, and I think you have you make a very good point there, Rami. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, I wasn't living through the time either, like Kareem, but there it seems like in the US at least there's this mythology that like the majority of the population relatively early on was in opposition to the war. But I always calls to mind when Chomsky would talk about organizing really early protests against the war. There was no support whatsoever, even on a college campus. Like he was saying, people would be throwing rocks through the windows of the little meeting rooms that they had to oppose the war. So early on, the vast majority of people were in support of the war. I think the opposition to it came a lot from college campuses, and there you had like a lot of I don't know, radical is really not the right word because it doesn't get to the root of the problem, but radical in the other sense of being a hippie and taking drugs and all of that, the counterculture like that. Looking back on it, and of course hindsight is 2020, but I don't have much stock for the that kind of counterculture, like the woo-woo people today, like the new age spirituality movements. It's like get real about politics, or just stay off, do your own thing. So the fact that a lot of the people in the hippie movement became Wall Street financiers, etc., that's not that much of a surprise to me. I think the polls that we're seeing of the younger generations now is much more the result of the radical changes, the fundamental transformative changes in the media system and the information system. It's just the fact that people have much more access to information. You take a hippie in the 60s or 70s, when they get off the college campus where they might have some radical professors, some radical students. You get off that campus and you go into the real world, and what source of information do you have? You've got the TV networks, you've got the major newspapers. You're screwed. You have no connection to reality. You're in a propaganda hothouse. And most people, even in the younger generation, are still going to be in a propaganda hothouse to the extent that they use the most mass media outlets. But I think the reason for that public opinion shift is much more the result of people being able to get information they would never get if they were restricted to TV, radio, and newspapers. But that's my hopeful view.
I think on the Vietnam War, we can just also note that America conducted that war itself, and there was a draft. And so that draft affected people tremendously. And so Americans were coming back in body bags. And I think, wars have since shifted. Maybe it'll change back now if they want to have boots on the ground with Iran. But they've had, proxies, and they have private military contractors and whatnot. So they found other people to die for them. And so also, a lot of times in the Vietnam War, even those that are so-called more radical, it was kind of... they were more concerned about America suffering a strategic defeat than they were about the humanity of Vietnamese people. And even, the United States' actions afterwards, as in supporting Pol Pot along with China, as in creating a massive embargo on Vietnam, basically starving them to death. So, it's really kind of sad to consider it. Now Vietnam seems to be pulling itself up and is actually a fast-growing economy. But how they set them back tremendously with all those chemicals, Agent Orange, the tremendous amount of rapes, killing. just an absolute eugenics program conducted, and that was after a century of colonization by the French. So I think there's a lot also that explains this evolution of those so-called hippies. I think you nailed on a good point, Peter. Those hippies are a bit individualistic as well, which I support. You should be able to do what you want. However, without there's always an antagonism between private and public interest. So without a connection to a collective good, public interest, maybe common ownership of the means of production, I digress, but without a kind of more larger conception of the world that's both autonomous but connected to a larger group, neoliberalism is going to be able to adapt itself pretty well. Capitalism is so resilient and it co-opts everything. I remember Jackie Luqman, a great revolutionary Black journalist, when she said that they will take the tears of African people and sell them to them in Juneteenth flavored ice cream at Walmart, which literally exists.
Yeah, I like Luqman. Yeah.
So it's just the resilience. There's a lot of factors as well. And I appreciate the kind of analysis that says that people become more right-wing later in life. Fair enough. But there are a lot of social factors related to that. It's not just this kind of chimera of human nature and so on, because if you were in a more centralized Soviet bureaucracy where you had privilege because you were connected to the government, but that government also was less unequal than in the West, as Thomas Piketty's studies have shown, well, you would want to conserve a more progressive society, but because it benefited you personally as well. And this goes a long way. Not everybody that calls themselves a socialist, a communist, an anarchist is really committed to the ideology. And as some people have pointed out, is there's a long history of turncoats and people that are in those parties just so they can advance their own personal interest, and they could care less about the collective. So I think like the hippie movement can be explained a little bit about you mentioned self-help. Those self-help people, right, and nutrition and all that, they're quite right-wing these days, right? They want to get off the grid, but not get off a grid to start an independent labor movement. They want to get off the grid to basically move to Puerto Rico and use their Western accumulated wealth to buy goods or buy labor that's much lower cost, where the population in Puerto Rico is not living at the same level. So tremendous amounts of contradictions. And I think that kind of explains a little bit how neoliberalism was able to adapt itself to a hippie generation.
And I also think that Palestine has kind of exposed how our own markets here are being used to legitimize this war. We've seen massive amounts of censorships. I mean, Trump is forcing TikTok to be sold because it looks like it's one of the only platforms where you could relatively post more about Palestine than the others. But
still kidnapping people, by the way. Still kidnapping people. We hardly hear people talking about that anymore.
Yeah.
With
No, exactly, right.
Flights putting off their radar and shipping off prisoners.
No, definitely. And Zaid, you've mentioned the opposition to the war in Vietnam possibly being caused by the fact that people were coming back in body bags, and it was more for selfish reasons, let's just say, that the public opinion was able to be swayed. Do you feel like the public opinion, we're noticing now Macron coming up with bolder statements related to Palestine, obviously nowhere near what's needed, but we're seeing some last minute efforts to recognize a pseudo-Palestinian states over borders that no one even recognizes or could even be traced. Do you feel like that kind of shift happening in these Western policies related to Palestine could be caused by the fact that, for their own selfish reasons, that Western civilization is at stake? Our own population here in the West are noticing that our policies are in contradiction to these so-called liberal values of promoting human life and liberty and freedom for everyone. Is this, I mean, are we seeing the West shifting their policies because we cannot live with that illusion that we've set up for so long?
Well, I actually don't think so, and I think right now the West is in a place, or the West, collective West, but let's say in the United States, Canada, they're in a place where they actually cannot change their policies. What they do is not rational. They're moving according to path dependency in one case. So all the things and all the assets and all the investments that they've done, ideologically, politically, materially, they keep on going down that path. An argument could be made, like the societies are so the economic disparity since 1980 has increased of course, what the French call the end of Les Trente Glorieuses, all that economic development after World War II, of course, right? It's not sustainable. It's not possible. I mean, to reach a level of economic development that's at 5, 6, 7% every year once you're a kind of developed economy. So I think, right now they're just managing the problem via discourse, and it's very cynical right now. And we've heard it from Mark Carney as well. And sometimes I even get a bit optimistic. Hey, he might be a bit different than Trudeau. And then he calls for a Palestinian Zionist state afterwards. A real policy that would address the anxieties of the local population would be a more, let's say, I want to say, and then devoid of ideology, but a nationalistic policy, a policy that the body politic looks at in order to benefit the lives of people. It doesn't have the capacity to do so. Politicians are commodities. They're bought and sold for the benefit of those that have money, which are the elite, the bourgeoisie, if you will, those that, and we're way further than the bourgeoisie that Marx talked about, because now that's he predicted it, but it's a tremendously financialized bourgeoisie. It's not the productive industrial bourgeoisie that we have, which has all sorts of problems in terms of appropriation of surplus value and surplus labor and so on. But at least they created something. They gave us shoes and electricity. Maybe governments used to invest into large-scale infrastructure programs, because the history of it is that to build a railroad system or to build a large-scale electrical system, you needed to have government support because the return on investment is so long. So you need to have, within a capitalist framework, a state that could take on those large-scale projects that don't generate revenue. They're destroying all of that. This has been kind of theorized as well, because and I'll just lean on the great philosopher Hannah Arendt, both the ideology of racism and imperialism has to destroy the internal body politic. So when Trump goes to war and bombs Iran, of course, Congress is a pliant partner, but he's violating the Constitution and the War Powers Act. Congress should have the right to declare war and to also fund the war as well. I mean, at least in the way it's framed. Racism is way more powerful, according to Hannah Arendt, than nationalism, because it is internationalist in nature. Karim, you mentioned we must decolonize our brains, so our frames of thought, our culture are largely informed by Western civilization, Western values. And by the way, we need to be clear, not the Western working class, well, the Western bourgeoisie, the elite that produces the movies, the films, the journalism, and so on. And so that's what we have to that's what has to be basically one has to be liberated from that, essentially. So there's an entire cultural framework that is basically that is basically acting upon people's minds and getting them to kind of consent to certain projects that are not beneficial to the body politic and the nation state. So even considering in terms of nation state, when you look at racism or Orientalism, but let's look at racism as a kind of prevailing ideology, it can really be popular because it's internationalist in nature. It's not, you can be a racist in Lebanon, and you can be a racist in the United States, and all these are in China, and these are all social constructs, so they can be modified and changed. You can racialize a community, like you can racialize a Shia people in Lebanon or in Iraq or whatever you may want. You can racialize, of course, Black people. You can racialize a white Caucasian woman that becomes Muslim and she wears a hijab. She gets racialized. So we need to understand what that means. Of course, racism living in dynamics of power. So we're still very much in that framework. But of course, and I want to say, so imperialism destroys the body politic because it must do things internationally that it cannot necessarily get away with within the constitution of the national body politic, which is intended for that local population. But of course, there are people in that local population as well that are undesirables. So if you're in America, you might want to incarcerate, through the war on drugs, a large population of people of color and Black people. So that racism destroys the very foundation of the bourgeois democracy. And by the way, these things end up affecting white people, of course, as well, particularly those of the working class, right? The criminalization of poverty. People are coming out of prison in the US with debts. So I think there's a lot to it, and we're still in an imperialist, racist framework, basically, and it acts upon people, and even people in, that is the power of hegemony. Like, that is the power of consent, of broadcasting cultural systems via the internet, via TV, via a certain form of interpretation. So then we all now, all over the rest of the world, including the working class and the poor, working, and oppressed in the United States, for example, basically absorb those racist imperialist schemes that are conferred to them through all the cultural institutions in a society. So
sounds like could be in one of my lectures on cultural psychology that I teach here in China, and how these media systems actually keep us indoctrinated in a kind of imperialist, racist mindset. Indeed, don't know if you wanted to jump in, Peter.
Yeah, I guess I kind of was thinking a slightly different track. Like, I'm kind of starting to see things as a little weaker on the side of the U.S. ruling class. Like, there was an interview of some former Pentagon official that Tucker Carlson did like a week or two ago, and the guy said something like, Tucker was complaining about the neocons' power in the Trump administration, et cetera. And this guy, former Pentagon official, said, I think what's going on is the neocons realize that this is their last chance, that their ideas are DOA. Nobody believes their ideas under the age of X. And all of these people in the Pentagon, or I forget how he defined it, but like the national security apparatus, all the young people, they make you and me, he's talking about himself and Carlson, look like Paul Wolfowitz, because they're so radically in a non-interventionist direction. So he's thinking that this is kind of like the last gasp of the neocons realizing that they're going to be out of power soon, and they're trying to maximize their use of power right now. And that kind of gels well with an observation that I think probably anyone can make, which is that the US ruling class is made up of a bunch of fucking morons, and they themselves basically admit it, because now the conventional wisdom in the ruling class in the US is that their China policy over the past few decades was an absolute abject failure. So everything that you would have believed going to elite schools, being socialized in the US, probably just the West in general, over the past few decades, has now been proven definitively wrong. They now all recognize that their entire idea was a huge failure. And let's not just stop at the China policy. We can continue on with the illegal invasion of Iraq. At the time, anyone who had any measure of power in the US was full-throated in support of it. That was the dominant view. That was the consensus view. Now, the consensus view is the exact opposite. So it just takes a moment of reflection to realize that the class that's been ruling the US, the people with disproportionate political economic power, their track record, and half century, let's say, has been one of now nearly universally recognized failure. So I think there's something there between this one little indication of younger people, even in the national security apparatus, young people in the broader population that opinion polls reveal, and just the obvious failure of the U.S. ruling class, even insofar as they themselves admit it on major topics, I think is a harbinger of change it would have to be in a positive direction. It's hard to imagine it being much worse.
And Peter, this makes me think. I mean, you've mentioned kind of this last-ditch effort by the neocons because they might be forever weakened. It reminds me a bit how the center of hegemony kind of went from the UK, Britain, after World War II to the United States. And the United States kind of expanded after World War II during the Cold War with its whole Marshall Plan, keeping its tight grip over its, let's just say, satellite states, its colonies. But the fact is that right now, after October 7th, there's a new reality on the ground that America is imposing over the Middle East. And even when we're seeing what's happening in Ukraine, that last-ditch effort by the neocons could maybe signal a shift from the center of hegemony from the UK to the United States to now maybe somewhere between Ukraine and Israel. I don't know. This whole war, there was a tweet that I saw the other day saying, wherever the aid not the flotilla, the land bridge that was going from like Morocco to Palestine to Gaza, wherever it ends symbolizes the borders of Israel, right? And it seems like the border of Israel now is kind of somewhere around Cairo, because I think this is where the aid convoy stopped. But similarly, wherever Israel's limits of where it can bomb also signifies where its borders end. And today that's somewhere around maybe Tehran. So I do see that there's like a shift on the ground that is happening to keep the same interest that the neocons have, all by changing the reality in the ground. Witkoff announced that there's going to be an expansion of the Abraham Accords. There's this Arab NATO project that was in the works over the last decade or so, which was like an alliance between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, at this point, probably Israel as well. And that new reality will make it so that Israel keeps its role in the Middle East as being this kind of fracture point that stops the Middle East from ever uniting and becoming a unified bloc that has control over the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, access to so much oil and natural gas. So I'm more wary now of seeing where that shift of the neocons will end and where that new center of hegemony will now be. Yeah.
If I may jump in on that, I think we can shift gears a bit to that the geopolitical aspect around Iran. So we've been discussing this with multiple guests, such as Kevork Almashyan, who's often quite critical of the way Iran responds, and many of the other actors in the resistance. And often he has very, very good information. I always appreciate listening to him. We just had Moin Rabbani on, who is a Dutch Palestinian guy who also has very good analysis and is more positive also about the way Iran dealt with Israel. Zaid, your opinion. I heard you talk about it with Dimitri and Rami in another show, and I really thought you had a very good and nuanced analysis also about China and Russia's role. How do you see it now play out? First of all, how do you see the reaction of Iran? Are you of the school of thought that says, well, they should have done more and they should not have stopped? Some would even say they need a how do you say that? A mushroom. They need to show a mushroom cloud if they want to save themselves. Others say, well, they did a good job and they actually created some deterrence. And that's why the United States and Israel backed off, so to speak. What is your assessment?
I mean, it's really difficult to tell right now. Okay, so the because I actually think this is going to continue. Of course, not of Iran's accord, but of the United States and Israel, and however that plays out. I think, after this so-called ceasefire, there were some launches of drones within Iran, reports at least, and they were likely done from within Iran. So does the conflict take on a different form? I think Iran, I saw some reports, I cannot confirm it, but there was a report about this infiltration in Iran military and government networks of, well, they've been using Indian software essentially. And that Indian software has a backdoor to Israel, and essentially it's a repackaged Israeli software, some mixture like that. And so that tremendously, and so they've been getting backdoors, so all sorts of intelligence information, communications has been relayed to Israel, and so Iran has to take a look, because Hezbollah was also tremendously compromised, and that took them out of the game, at least for now. And so Iran, I think, maybe behind the scenes, has some cleaning up to do, and to unfortunately be a little bit more authoritarian as it relates to dissent, or military and Mossad related dissent, of course. And so I think right now they're maybe in a kind of they're in a cleansing, for lack of a better word, a cleansing policy internally. So they really got to be careful about that. On the other hand, they subsisted. I don't want to. Now it's today. I saw the Iranian government said there was about 935 deaths from this war in Iran. So it's significant. On the other hand, it appears, because of Iran's sheer size, that it hardly made a dent in a sense. And I'm hearing all these analysis. They're 2 months, 6 months away from now enriching uranium. I don't know that anyone has the real information. And where did the uranium go? I think, didn't they say that they coordinated with the U.S. and the U.S. just bombed Fordo? They took away all the enriched uranium. We have no clue where that is. Of course, that could be used as a pretext in the future, by Israel and America to attack Iran. They kicked out the IAEA inspectors, but the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, seems to have been feeding information to Israel. And so this is so sensitive. This is so sensitive. How could an international official that derives legitimacy from the United Nations be compromising the security of a country and not even condemning Israel for violating international law by bombing those nuclear sites? This is, and not even, at the very least requesting Israel be a signatory to the non-proliferation treaty. There are so many problems. And so people like this are destroying international institutions, whatever their faults are. But I think time will tell now with Iran. So it was positive that the Gulf Arab countries did not participate. Now they said, Iran said something positive about Saudi Arabia helping to negotiate a settlement, a peace agreement. So I think I think Israel is hurt, but they're escalating the genocide in Gaza with this trick with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and just firing at people constantly. So we'll have to see. But I think, all of this is chipping away at the fortress Israel, the invincibility of Israel. And these are settlers. The psychology of the settler and the indigenous person is quite different, or the social psychology of a group. And they have a place to go. A lot of them, they can go elsewhere, and they have quite a bit more wealth, and they live a more luxurious life with more creature comforts. They have less tolerance for this. Iran's been under attack for many, many years, and they don't have another place to go. So the very existence of Israel is conditioned on, of course, the demographic control and destruction of the Palestinian people, but also on this infallible security. So we hear all these terms like Iron Dome and David's Sling and Arrow and so on and so forth, right? All these terms are supposed to increase the confidence. And we heard also reports that Israel was not allowing people to leave Israel because they know, of course, controlling demographics is their number one game. And that includes, yes, the Palestinians, but their own population. So I just think time will tell. But I think Iran is in a decent position right now. They handled it.
Just to continue, Israel exposed itself as not being this Western economy that is worth investing in. It's a country prone to getting hit by ballistic missiles. I don't believe any other Western country would fit that narrative as well. So Israel has shown itself to be an exception. I think there was a report here saying that there was $3 billion in material damages that Iran was able to inflict in less than 2 weeks. And that's without counting the damages that are pretty much impossible to measure, which is the loss of future opportunities, the fragility of the state, and all the repercussions that comes from there. I think it's in Israel's interest if this war escalates into a World War III, where Israel has major security guarantees from the United States. We need to understand kind of the dynamics between Israel and its backers, right? NATO, France, UK, United States. So as long as this war keeps in the form of war of attrition, the time will come where the war will escalate under the terms of the acts of resistance. And we're seeing that term coming much, much more sooner. The latest NATO assembly that happened back in the Netherlands just a few weeks ago, they're talking now of increasing the NATO military contribution to 5%. Now, this might seem like a great decision because it's going to increase your military, but this is decaying your the services and infrastructure of these countries, right? So basically, the entire West becomes a funnel of cash to American military companies, and we might not feel the damage today, but there's a price to pay in putting 5% of your GDP into weapons, and that's going to be off of your education, off of the healthcare system, off of all these different social services. So gradually, the West, by hyper-militarizing itself due to the conflicts happening in Ukraine, in Palestine, and possibly Taiwan, we're going to witness a corrosion or erosion of the social safety net in the West. And to come back to this topic of
And
Iran,
but if I can just quickly jump in, Rami, plus of course just culturally,
yes,
the cultural effect of that hyper militarization of Europe is dramatic. I
it's
mean,
an Israel in the
Europe is
making.
already a hyper militarized, aggressive, expansionist culture. I'm now generalizing all these cultures together, but there is a kind of generalized expansionist, hyper imperialist culture.
Mhm.
I mean, look at Germany. I mean, Germany is such a good example of this completely depraved, hyper militarized mindset that still cannot really deal with its past and genocides. In fact, it doubles down. These people are gonna expand their military.
I mean, in the France, it's very common to see 3 military guys with machine guns basically patrolling the streets. Never seen this once in China. And we were talking here about Iran's ability to get a nuclear bomb. Well, first of all, Iran said that they're not interested in getting a nuclear bomb. But what we do know is that their nuclear facilities, I see it as a great comparison to the resistance in Gaza in throwing rockets. It's more of a beating pulse of symbolizing its sovereignty. Iran has a right to have a civilian nuclear infrastructure, just like any country in the world. It abides by the NPT. It abides by its international commitments and agreements to the international community. So I think Iran's so it's irrelevant really if they're 2 weeks away, 2 months away, or 2 years away from getting a nuclear bomb. Whatever they choose to do with their nuclear facilities, it's a symbol of their sovereignty, and they're a symbol of their self-determination within this region. And this whole crackdown on Iran's nuclear facilities is symbolizes as well how countries who are not submitted to Israel do not have a right to exist or have their own self-determination. And we see this with countries like Saudi Arabia, right, who are fully submitted to Israel, who are asking permission to. I mean, they said that if Iran gets a nuclear bomb, they'll get one as well. So I commend Iran for keeping up its nuclear programs. It shows that they're not submitted to anyone, and no country should ever be. It's a symbol for every country in the region to take up on Iran's call of standing up for themselves and doing what every sovereign state has a right to do.
Yeah, absolutely, and it also, yeah, that's the whole idea of self-determination, and every country has the right to enrich uranium or for peaceful means and that kind of stuff. Don't forget, all these institutions and rules and laws and international law was just bullshit. And especially brown Muslims will never have the same rights in the mindset of the European colonizer. It's just not going to happen. So we can forget about all these discussions about all countries have the right. Also, same with resistance. We in the Netherlands, we still celebrate the resistance against Nazi Germany, even though the Dutch were one of the most horrible colonizers. We just don't talk about that anymore. Apartheid is a Dutch word, apartheid. So, but we celebrate the resistance, and don't forget the resistance against the Nazis. They used car bombs and that kind of stuff. They used so-called terrorism. They're heroes in our books, but yet colonized people resisting against colonizers? No. That's a different story. Brown people in the rest of the world, forget it. You don't have the same right. We don't celebrate you. You know what I mean? But just one more question about the whole Iran thing, and I want to hear you guys' opinion about this because there's big discussions about this all the time, and that is the role of Russia and China in all this. I hear a lot of stories. For example, we had some guests on named Fiorella Isabel and Vanessa Beeley, very good journalists who also come from the region that itself. So Fiorella lives in Russia, Vanessa lives in Lebanon, and they are very critical of Russia. They're very critical of Russia. That Russia, for example, let Syria go. They were bombing empty land, so they had some kind of deal probably with the West. Other people say, I think it was Kevork, I'm not sure, that, for example, Iran ordered weapons from Russia, never got those weapons. while Russia says different things. I have the feeling that Russia often plays a bit of a duplicitous game. On the one hand, they're so-called resistance and they're against Western Empire, but on the other hand, they come across. I heard a Marxist once on the internet say that I forgot his name, but very interesting guy, and he said that Russia has a latent wish to be part of the imperialist club, and I believe that. I see that too. They often just wish to be part of that. I know Russia once also wanted to be part of NATO. You know what I mean? And with China, I hear often the complaint to which I am also sensitive, I must say, is that it's extremely passive and it doesn't realize the depravity of Western imperialism. It's encroaching upon China's borders. And where is China? People are saying, like, guys, you cannot debate and you cannot argue yourself out of imperialism. These guys are absolutely depraved, absolutely insane. They stop at nothing. They'll burn the world, literally. You know what I mean? So before I ramble on too long, what are your guys' thoughts about Russia and China in this whole, especially Iran situation?
I would say the first thing about China is that it does not have the capacity to power project, nor does it have the capacity to culturally project. And I'm saying actually that might be quite libertarian. I mean, socially libertarian. They're not seeking to change the values and establish systems of consent that will just consume Chinese products and view the world in a Chinese Confucianistic or kind of a Communist Party of China type of way, and so on and so forth. So now that's good in a sense. That's good in the sense that different human societies and social formations and individuals should be allowed to do what they want. We shouldn't go and impose on everybody. Now, I would say certain things are universal, like the universal rights of women and other things such as that, right? But there's a process to this. But imposing it from the outside, and especially imposing economic schemes like the West does in terms of neoliberalism and financial restructuring and so on and so forth, that's problematic. But on the other hand, if you don't have a consensual system, a system that can project beyond your geographical borders, or let's say in a class perspective, a communist international, a socialist international, and so on, which probably be better, especially if it was grassroots and not just controlled from Moscow, for example. Well, in the absence of that, then you're not going to be able to change hearts and minds. It's kind of pitiful. How much does the Iranian message get out to Western audiences? How much of an effort do they make? And the same thing for China. It's almost like everything about China is just the knowledge about China is constructed by journalists and Western elites and those who write books and yellow peril types and so on and so forth. And I think. I remember reading China just took out 35,000 workers out of Libya before the bombing, and I understand, but they're totally pacifistic. Now, how are you going to build? The thing is this: that if you're going to have economic investment in foreign countries, sadly, you're going to have to bring some military might to protect that economic investment. So if you're looking at that's the history of imperialism and capitalism. Economic expansion cannot exist without the expansion of power, i.e. a political system that can basically wage violence through a monopoly on violence. So if China builds a Belt and Road and international north-south transportation corridor, which passes by Iran, if you cannot protect that and defend it, or the various countries have solid security arrangements to protect it, well, then you're completely those investments are just going to go to nil. And so I just wonder for China, at what point are they going to, and I'm not saying culturally project, but power project a little bit as well? Because how do you build large-scale infrastructure projects if you don't have the means to defend them? I would say Russia seems opportunistic. I would agree exactly with everything you've said, Kareem. Even on their conduct with Israel. In December of 2023, Sergei Lavrov said that the connection between Israel and Russia is forever lasting due to the opposition to the Nazis. I have to ask the question: why would Israel obtain the prestige from the Jews who suffered in the Holocaust, who weren't Zionists by their very actions? They never went to Israel. They remained in a hostile Europe. So why does, just like the assets through the Havara Agreement of German Jews were sent to Israel? It's a 1936 agreement. Those German Jews are not the state of Israel. So that's a kind of orthogonal point about the inheritance, if you will, both materially and culturally, or the suffering that goes from the Holocaust or European Jews right into Israel, when the reality is those European Jews did not go to Israel. And of course, that was an opposition between socialist Jews and nationalistic or Zionist Jews. So I think Russia were opportunistic in Syria. I mentioned the thing that they never provide oil tankers to Bashar al-Assad's government, but they did provide them to Ahmad al-Shara's or Joulani's government. So they're very opportunistic right now. I would agree as well with what the person you referenced. There is a latent desire to be part of the West. And does that fall into Edward Said's Orientalist scheme? Russia is largely dominated by Western Slavs, largely, historically. Maybe the Soviet Union was an attempt to kind of change that or propagandize in favor of that, if you will. Like we have Asians, we have women, and so on. But it's largely dominated by Western Europeans. Its civilization looks towards the West. They're very friendly with China right now. Will that also create some kind of cultural interaction as well, cultural interdependence and understanding and respect? So, I think also Russia, just on a different note, it's been 3 years since the war in Ukraine has started. And so where does this go? Is it a perpetual war of attrition? I remember Scott Ritter saying in, December of 2022 is going to be over because winter is going to be too hard. And man, Ukraine keeps fighting. And of course, they're getting support from the West and mercenaries and so on and so forth. But what is Russia's end game there? And I think for the masses in the world, there was a time before World War I, for example, that socialists and liberals and people that were pacifists all over the world organized to oppose war. I mean, in Italy, there was tremendous demonstrations both for and against the war, okay, in World War I. We don't have that. What would be really heartwarming would be Ukrainians, Americans, Russians, and people all over the world standing up to end the conflict at some point. And I think we get caught up very much in, not anyone personally, but in the nation state prism of how we view things. So it just ends up being Russia versus Ukraine. And then it's, well, are Ukrainians Russians or are they not? We're one people, we're not one people. And these are just subjective systems of interpretation, and that are kind of derived from systems of racial purity and so on, and they're irrelevant. They should not be relevant in any enlightened society and way of viewing the world. Mm-hmm. What's best for people. So in the end, Russia and their role in West Asia, even the tremendous connection to the UAE. The UAE does horrible things in Western Africa, in Socotra, south of Yemen, in the support of Israel. They even had troops in Libya. So it's really hard, when people talk about BRICS. I think there is potential in BRICS, but it is not a strong centralized oppositional force. One of the geniuses, and sadly it's not democratic, of the United States is that they control the entire Western European framework. So all the decisions are made in Washington, and centralized regimes or centralized.
And sorry to interrupt, Zaid, but also, of course, the glue of white supremacy. Yeah, that latent glue of white supremacy is so powerful.
Absolutely. So that's a consensual system, or as Charles Wade Mills called the racial contract, and kind of juxtaposed to social contract. And so it's just Russia's role, like exactly. I was talking about BRICS. So BRICS has potential, but it's not a centralized form of governance, which is sort of democratic. That's nice. So more form of devolved power. But the way the United States can make decisions via, you mentioned NATO. NATO is a platform where they're buying 40% of the military materials from the United States, and largely the United States is making the decision. Even the European Union, how it could have been something more liberal and independent, really ends up just being a really convenient platform for the US to control all of the EU through Ursula von der Leyen and the executive, this kind of semi-democratic system. So there's a lot of questions there. So BRICS doesn't have that. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and in a better world, that would be sufficient. But unfortunately, when you're facing violent threat, both to your physical self and your assets, infrastructure, well, you're going to require more of a, unfortunately, security state and centralized form of control. It's a really sad dialectic, but that's kind of what the U.S. has, and it's being reinforced by Donald Trump right now. And he's chipping away at all democratic liberties within the country. So just opening the door. So there is optimism about the end of the neocons, but man, the crisis of capitalism, as Marxists would call it, if we just put it in that frame, it doesn't always go in the right direction. It doesn't always lead to something better for the people. It could lead to a rise of Hitler, for example. And man, I just had the last thing I'll say, that view the United States and families just being descended upon by paratroopers, stormtroopers, these brown shirts, this Gestapo, ICE, and it's kind of normal, even how it's reported on in the Canadian press, as if this is not just a tremendous violation of human dignity, civil rights, civil liberties. Even in the U.S. law, they're talking about criminals and so on, and whereas they're just deporting everybody, even that has protected status. So I don't have that much faith right now, even in the changing of public opinion and how they view the world, and the end of the neocon order. It might just transform in another form, but we really need mass people movements. And that's why I think of World War I, where that existed, and Lenin and Luxembourg working tirelessly to get, the socialist parties to demilitarize, to have their countries demilitarized, and so on and so forth. We need it. And so I just would, it would be nice to see protests against the war in Russia and Ukraine by a huge amount of people around the world.
Sorry, I just want to take like a tiny step back and say that our relations towards Russia and China should be based on, we could only be disappointed if, depending on what we expect from them. Just keep in mind that China, I'm disappointed in China for not having resolved their own Taiwan issue decades ago, right? Similarly, in 1999, when the United States intentionally, purposefully bombed China's embassy in Yugoslavia, in Belgrade, China never responded. And they sought, what they were able to get out of this was, I think, access to the World Trade Organization. So our disappointment could only come depending on what we expect from Russia and China. Do I expect Russia to liberate Palestine and to fight this war for us? Absolutely not. And I know we're disappointed based on just them giving up on Syria, but I'm actually surprised they even got into Syria in the first place. And there's a cost, I believe, in terms of, let's just say, military involvement. If we want China to start pushing their power, flex their muscles, there's also a price to pay back home. So first of all, military is not a form of productive investment, or doesn't bring any material good to your own social fabric, right? It's not building anything, it's actually destroying. So if China was to push any change in the region, impose any change, as they've done during the Mao years, right, or at least during a certain part of the Cold War up until the 1980s, well, when China was involved in Korea, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and Laos, they had to sustain their involvement and make sure that whatever change they impose can sustain after they leave. So I'm just wondering, if China starts getting too involved in, let's just say, Latin America, if they start pushing their submarines and warships all across the world, it means that they need to impose something that is not sustainable. And I know, Zaid, you've mentioned that that they need to protect their ports and their investments all over the world. But I could see that they were able to gain market share across the world, becoming the top exporter for basically more than half of the world, without any imposing their military. They only have one military base in Burundi, and they're still able to sustain that trade. So, and I know we're disappointed in BRICS by not being too imposing in the region. You mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but and this is where when I was involved in Palestine organizing back in my university years, I expected the liberation to come, within our efforts, right? But there are incremental change that are sustainable, being cemented, and going to be impossible to replace. And if we open up our timeline and horizon, I do see that through strategic involvement from China and Russia, we are getting incrementally better and closer to the liberation of Palestine. And it's mainly because the dynamics as they are today are not going to sustain any meaningful change in the region. And I know this might sound a bit shocking what I'm saying, but we need to weaken the belly of the beast. We need to make sure that the Western world is losing traction and that the engine is going slower in order to start those major changes that we're looking for. I was Karim, when I was in and Peter, when I was in Hong Kong, I read a bit about the how China was able to take back Hong Kong, and I believe the island of Kowloon was supposed to stay under the British rule, or there's like one specific island that was supposed to stay under British rule, but China was still able to absorb it entirely using its might, let's just say, um, and they were offered. I think China was offered to take Macau back in the 1970s because there was a socialist revolution that happened in Portugal at that time, and they wanted to let go of all of their colonies. And China still refused to take Macau because they were scared of not being able to. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, folks, because you guys know China a bit more better than me. But they refused to take Macau out of fear of not being able, out of fear that it might lose their opportunity to get Hong Kong. Or to create, I mean, it would show failure in Macau, and that would push people away in Hong Kong from reuniting with China. So, I mean, China has been reluctant in taking over Taiwan. It's going to take the time it takes, and there's a whole order that needs to be implemented in order to fully absorb Taiwan in a sustainable way where you're not imposing control over anyone. And this incremental change is happening. Russia was able to build its own financial transaction network, right? The Mir payment system. It's strongly integrated with the Chinese financial system and the Iranian financial system. There's a whole disconnect, right? There's like these spheres of influence need to start being separated in order to sustainably have this meaningful change that we're looking for, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Taiwan, or whether it is in Eastern Europe. So I mean, when it comes to, and I agree that maybe China and Russia are maybe don't understand the stakes that are at ground right now in Iran. I mean, if Iran was to collapse tomorrow, that would be detrimental for China and for Russia, of course. But I don't want to minimize the progress that we're seeing either.
I think that there is a bit of a lack of confidence also in the formerly colonized world, and I include China in that. Even though China was not formerly colonized, of course, it was almost fully colonized back in the day, and I think that also plays a role among many countries in the world, including China, in the sense that I think China sometimes also underestimates its own power and leverage, and does not yet maybe have that confidence to make bold decision against empire. To give you an example, I think that China doesn't need warfare to really harm the United States. Chinese can simply make use of their power that they can exert through, for example, their rare earth minerals. For example, if they cut that off, they completely bring the U.S. economy to a halt. Use it. I mean, be bold. Be bold like these imperialists. They will bow. I think the United States will get on their knees. I mean, if the corporations, if all their for-profit machinery in the United States is starting to lose profit, within no time they'll beg China to please don't do that. But if you do nothing, they become super bold. You see the same with Israel. If they don't get any pushback, these people just go completely crazy. You know what I mean? And I think that is something that is a bit lacking, not only with China, Russia also, by the way, but I see that with China even more, in the sense that, don't get me wrong, I live here in China, and I admire China and Chinese culture, and what I like about the Chinese is actually that they are conflict avoidant. They come from a culture that is conflict avoidant, which provides a very safe, calm environment to live in. But on the global stage, when you have a conflict avoidant nature against a group of people, a culture that is conflict searching or conflict embracing, you can almost say. Yeah, you have to be bold, and the Chinese, 1 out of 5 people on Earth is Chinese. They're a major power. I mean, that confidence. I think there is a kind of a confidence lacking still. I don't know if you guys agree.
I don't know. I think that comes down to an empirical question. It's kind of like talking about Iran strategy without knowing the relative stock of armaments on the two sides. It's a irrelevant exercise to guess when you don't know that key bit of information. Same thing with China. There was an article in the FT today or yesterday on the choke points in the Chinese economy, the areas where they're still reliant on imports from Japanese, US, and European firms. So, the idea, which I'm not entirely sure about, but let's assume that if China cut off all rare earth exports, it already has them under export control. So they're not shipping to US military manufacturers. But assuming that they could just shut off the pipeline entirely and that would do massive damage, well, it goes both ways. The US and its allies can do the exact same thing to China in a bunch of ways that simply just aren't on the media radar.
But they do. That's the thing. They do. They already do stuff like that. They already.
Yeah, I'm saying they could do a lot worse. That's the thing. Like we also don't know the full extent of, going through a massive sheet of various inputs, from technological inputs to raw material inputs, and doing the calculations to see, okay, if we got cut off from X, Y, Z, what would the effects be? All of this is not in the public domain. The little bit that was in this FT story, and that's not nothing. When it gets down to is China taking the right approach here? I mean, there's too much that we don't know to make a firm judgment on that. But on the other side of it, a lot of things that aren't being talked about much about what China is already doing. The Israeli military put all sorts of censorship on the missile impacts during the 12-day war, as they're calling it. If those missiles were not guided and they weren't precise, we would have seen every single impact. That would have been on TV. Oh my God, a school, a house, etc. The amount of that kind of propaganda, the waving the bloody shirt propaganda, was extremely limited, which leads me to conclude that those strikes were actually quite targeted. Now, Iran hasn't been developing its own satellite network system or precision guidance for its missiles. That came from China. But you don't hear a lot of bragging or talk about it, which is, I think, good, because it keeps China off the it's already the number one target for the national security state in the US. They know that quite well, and I think that's the major factor in their calculations that doesn't get a lot of attention, because we're not in that painted target. Well, actually, you and me, we are in that painted target technically. But anyway, sorry, I just realized we're well over the 1 hour.
Yeah. Maybe your thoughts, and then we can wrap it up.
Well, I mean, I definitely agree with. I mean, I agree with most of everything was said, and I think you're right. Like, our lack of knowledge, and I think the mainstream media and Western pundits have a lot of confidence in that lack of knowledge, because a lot of it, they share the same lack of knowledge that we have, but they make pronouncement with all the, and Trump as well. Trump as well, of course. We destroyed all their facilities and so on and so forth. And so I think that's important. I think I'm just, my personal view is that, and it's a bit like what Kareem said, is that this octopus of Western imperialism continues to expand and to transmutate itself and to continue to threaten the interests of other countries. And we've had, like, for example, in West Asia, as well as Serbia, or Yugoslavia, state after state after state destroyed. I mean, right now, Trump ping-pongs between Iran, and maybe in a couple of weeks, he'll come back to Venezuela being a dictatorship that threatens the U.S. interests, right? And then, of course, they're, as you mentioned, angling towards China. And so I also don't see, so what worries me is that, well, on one hand, these, I guess, countries that are not aligned with the United States, well, as we mentioned, Russia and China, they're maybe not as aggressive enough. Okay, that's one thing. I mentioned before also, we're not seeing internationalist mass peace movements, really in opposition. And then we're not seeing sufficient, like, state internationalism, and maybe countries are beat down. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, we haven't seen a recreation of international networks of solidarity, whether that's the Cubans going to Angola or the support of the Soviet Union into Angola and Vietnam, and even supporting the Syrian government at the time. So a deterrent oppositional force to try to limit at least how much well, particularly U.S. imperialism was impacting the world. So I think that's where. So I'm not putting it all on China and Russia. I do think Russia is pretty opportunistic, and I think you make, Peter, good points that China behind the scenes is certainly giving Iran technology. But then it's in those different spheres as well. So people power as well as genuine internationalism in terms of supporting militarily other people that are under the same threat. So I think that's where a bit of my disappointment, and also goes into the cultural spheres we talked about before. I mean, most people, I'm not sure, I don't have facts, but if I went to Thailand or if I went to any other, let's say Nigeria, would most people believe in the two-state solution? Would they think that that's a fraud and just a way to deny the Palestinians the most basic rights enshrined within international law? I don't know. So it's just those various factors. But I would say that China has a lot to lose as well by not projecting a little bit more power, and that can be also by just arming other countries. They don't have to fight the wars themselves. So and of course, there's always the risk of a radical Islamist in the region of flaring up and getting arms and so on. We have a whole country now, Syria, and homogenizing the population right now, getting rid of Alawites and Christians as well, and the Shiites are no safer. A country or an area of this world that has had diversity from time immemorial, and of course, all it takes is, and this is the moment right now. So I guess those are my major concerns at the state level, at internationalist level, as well as international mass mobilization.
That's such a good point you make there, and it just you make such a good point. It just takes one radical Islamist group, and the whole thing just goes completely crazy. Like the United States is so good at doing that and just completely messing up complete societies that were harmonious, and they can do it to China too. I mean, they had tens of thousands of Uyghurs going to Syria. I mean, it's just waiting. Huh?
And then they're coming back to China.
And exactly, it's just waiting for problems to happen. And what happens then? Then you get all that crackdown on mosques and Muslims, and you get racism and discrimination and Islamophobia. Well, of course, these imperialists are behind it. It's so incredibly frustrating, because what are these countries doing then? They're going to do symptom. They're going to fight the symptoms instead of the cause. You know what I mean? Anyway, we could talk for a long time, guys. We're already at 1.5 hours, so thank you very much for your time. You've been very generous, and I hope Rami and Zaid that we can invite you again in the near future to do another roundtable update on the things that are going on, because this was excellent, man. I must say, I really liked it.
Yeah, great talking with you both. Zaid, nice to meet you, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk again soon in the future.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting you as well, and it was a good time and a stimulating discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, great. We call it Brothers Roundtable. Is that it?
Brothers Roundtable, man. Exactly. Brothers Roundtable.
Good. So yeah, and hopefully in Hong Kong one day, Hong Kong, China.
Yeah,
definitely. Come back. Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys.
Right. Have a good night or good morning.
حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي انا حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي تكتيكي تكتيكي